The air conditioning hummed in Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, blending with the murmur of hundreds of voices and muffled announcements. Karina, her heart pounding with anticipation for Vancouver, ran her hand along the handle of her rolling suitcase. A shiver, not from the cool air, but from something icy and insidious, ran through her. The vision erupted without warning. Flight 378 to Vancouver. Her flight amidst throbbing lightning, violently shaking. A silent scream. The fuselage tearing apart, engulfed in flames, plummeting into the void. She felt the impact, the thin air, the darkness. The smell of burning metal and the agony of hundreds of lives imprinted themselves on her mind. The horror etched itself into her. That plane would not reach its destination. The distant sound of turbines seemed like a lament, and the vibration of the ground beneath her feet, a premonition of the imminent impact. She stood there, on solid ground, but her mind had already experienced the fatal fall. Cold sweat trickled down Karina's temples, the sound of the premonition still echoing in her ears like an infernal hum. She blinked, trying to ward off the image of the explosion, but the smell of ozone, peculiar to lightning, seemed to permeate the air. The departure monitor, just above Gate 17, flashed, boarding now for Flight 378. An urgent, internal voice screamed at her to flee. But how? But I had a premonition. This plane ... it won't make it. It's going to crash. There was something genuinely painful and raw in the girl's eyes. What did you see, dear? The plane shook terribly, and then it exploded in the air, Karina described, the words tumbling out, the vivid details in her memory terrifying her anew. Look, kid, I understand you might be nervous, but this is ... fanciful. I felt the impact, the hot, thin air. I know what I saw. I feel it. You have to believe me, please. The acrid smell of smoke and burning metal. The panic of hundreds of voices, a silent, collective scream. I saw darkness swallow everything. But Sarah, with a keen eye, noticed a momentary glitch on the departure monitor and Karina's sudden pallor. She thought about the strange coincidence of the thunder, the urgency in Karina's eyes, the unwavering conviction in her voice. The flight attendant at the counter called rows 10 to 20 for boarding. Time was running out. I'll wait a bit longer. I'll call my team in Vancouver and let them know about the delay. But the relief was fleeting. The premonition wasn't just about the plane, but about death pursuing them, an relentless entity. She knew that fate had other plans, darker and more unexpected, for those who had escaped the first trap. The real fight was just beginning. The boarding gate was open, swallowing passengers one by one, and Karina felt a chill run down her spine. Time was running out, and death, she knew, was patient. But if nothing happens, I'll take the next flight. It was a minimal concession, but it was enough. The first trap had been diverted. For now. Daniel looked at his watch, at the plane sitting on the tarmac, imposing and seemingly harmless, and at the determination in Karina's and Sarah's eyes. He was torn. Logic versus the inexplicable. His career versus the instinct for self-preservation. He had an important contract to close in Vancouver. There was something there that transcended logic. Whatever it is, dear, Sarah said, looking at Karina with surprising calm. Whatever it is ... I won't board. I'll wait. Her voice was low but firm. Daniel stared at her, incredulous, his eyes wide. Ma'am, this is ridiculous. You're going to miss your flight because of a ... hunch from a girl? She shivered as she recalled the sensation. Or perhaps it's prudence. I've lived long enough to know when to listen to a gut feeling. And hers is too strong to ignore. The lights in the terminal flickered for an instant, and the "boarding now" announcement on the Gate 17 monitor, for a brief second, changed to "canceled" before reverting to the original. No one but Karina seemed to notice or care. Her eyes widened. It was a warning, a trap. Death was mocking her. Her voice was soft but imbued with a compassion that eased the knot in Karina's stomach. "Describe it." "In detail." A heavy silence hung between them, broken only by the announcement that boarding would begin in 5 minutes. Time was quickly running out. Daniel let out a humorless laugh, a dry, disbelieving sound. Karina's heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. She knew she had to do more. She needed a desperate act, something that could shake Daniel's unwavering conviction and perhaps persuade Sarah. She pointed to the dark sky visible through the terminal windows. The clouds were dense, shades of lead gray. "That storm. It wasn't predicted to be like this. It's a sign. It's for tonight, at the exact moment of the flight. Miss, with all due respect, I'm a software engineer. Flight safety is rigorous. Premonitions are not part of safety protocols." His voice was polite, but tinged with disdain. How could she convince strangers of a vision that seemed like madness? The subtle chaos of the airport, a child crying, the monotonous announcement of a gate, the dragging of suitcases, everything seemed to intensify, like a soundtrack to her terror. Her eyes met Daniel's, a man in an impeccable suit, engrossed in his laptop. He seemed the epitome of logic and reason, someone who would only believe in concrete facts. Near him, Sarah, with an open book on her lap, exuded an almost unshakable serenity, her glasses resting on the tip of her nose in a calm gaze that seemed to see beyond the surface of things. Karina took a deep breath, fear transforming into cold determination. She knew every second mattered. "Excuse me," she began, her voice trembling but charged with an urgency that couldn't be ignored. "I need to talk to you. It's about the flight to Vancouver." Daniel looked up, one eyebrow raised in skepticism. Sarah closed her book, her expression curious but attentive, as if sensing something unusual in the young woman's distress. "I know it sounds insane," Karina continued, her voice gaining firmness as the urgency of the situation overshadowed her embarrassment. Sarah, however, observed her with an intensity that surprised Karina. "An electrical failure during a violent storm with strobing lightning." Daniel sighed, returning to type on his laptop with an irritated click, clearly considering her an eccentric who might be suffering from pre-flight anxiety. "It's not nervousness." Karina interrupted him, her voice rising in pitch, attracting glances from other nearby passengers who were beginning to gather for boarding. The flight attendant at the gate announced the start of boarding for priority rows. A distant clap of thunder echoed, causing some passengers to look outside, curious. Daniel, upon hearing the thunder, mumbled something about unpredictable weather forecasts and faulty meteorological models. "Perhaps it is, my dear," Sarah replied, with an enigmatic smile on her lips. Sarah's decision created a small buzz among nearby passengers. "Look, if this storm gets worse, the flight will be delayed anyway," he reasoned, trying to rationalize the situation, seeking an out that wouldn't make him seem irrational. Karina felt a momentary relief, a deep sigh that released some of the tension in her chest. They weren't boarding, at least not now. The airport became a cauldron of tension. 20 minutes later, as the last passenger boarded Flight 378, the departure screen flashed red. Delayed, storm. A murmur of frustration spread through the terminal, followed by complaints from already exhausted passengers. Daniel, visibly annoyed, but with a barely concealed hint of relief, pulled out his phone. "Stupid storm," he muttered to himself, calling his office. His eyes, once skeptical, met Karina's, filled with unspeakable horror and belated comprehension. You were right," he whispered, his voice hoarse and almost inaudible, his face transformed by profound shock. "My God, you were right. We almost died. But we need facts. Did you see anyone suspicious? Anything unusual on the plane or during the boarding process? Any apparent mechanical failure?" He put his hands to his head, as if trying to contain the avalanche of reality. Now I have to reschedule everything and explain the delay. She felt death hovering, a cold, persistent mist around her, as if the very atmosphere of the room was charged with its presence. Daniel, still in shock, called her every few hours, his voice filled with an anxiety he tried, in vain, to disguise with questions about her well-being. She closed her eyes, the images of the explosion still vivid in her mind, mingling with a sense of guilt for having survived. The sound of sirens on the street below, the smell of bitter coffee from the hotel cafeteria, the artificial light of the room, everything seemed amplified. A sense of urgency gripped her. She needed to get out of there. She needed to warn Daniel and Sarah. Death had not given up. It had simply changed tactics, and now the game would get more personal. Sarah, in turn, had become a confidant, a voice of wisdom and support amidst the chaos. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice calm but with an implicit urgency. What happened was extraordinary, but now we need to be cautious. Fate has its own ways, and we cannot always avoid them. But we can be alert. Karina, Daniel, and Sarah, now united by a tragedy they had narrowly avoided, were interrogated as witnesses. Karina's story about the premonition was met with professional skepticism, looks of distrust, and cold politeness. However, they couldn't ignore the fact that 3 passengers, who claimed to have been warned by a vision, had not boarded and were now alive, and the possible causes of the explosion, while search and rescue teams scoured the crash site. For Karina, Daniel, and Sarah, the morning was different. It was mourning for the lives they had averted, mixed with a growing fear of what would come next, a feeling that the truce was temporary. It's not safe to stay. We need a calmer place to process this. The sound of torrential rain began to drum against the terminal windows, but the words seemed hollow in the cold, formal air of the interrogation, hitting a wall of logic and reason. It was useless. They wouldn't understand. They wouldn't understand that death didn't need a terrorist, an isolated mechanical failure, or a criminal. It simply existed, lurking, a relentless force. And now, she knew it was lurking for them. Sarah watched the scene with a calm that starkly contrasted with Karina's anxiety. A glimmer of understanding, and perhaps pity, was in her eyes. It was fate readjusting, a pause for death to regroup its forces. The plane was about to take off, and she knew, with an eerie certainty, that the storm would intensify in the air. And that was exactly what happened. 10 minutes after Flight 378 left the ground, the muffled sound of the turbines transforming into a distant hum, a deafening roar tore through the air. It wasn't ordinary thunder. It was a metallic sound, followed by a dull thud that made the terminal structures tremble. The lights flickered violently, and for an instant, everything plunged into semi-darkness. On the departure screen, the status of Flight 378 drastically changed to missing last known location unknown. "See, dear," she said, a gentle smile on her lips. The premonition had its truth. Panic began to spread like an invisible virus, infecting everyone. Flight attendants and security guards, with pale faces, tried in vain to calm the crowd. But news of the tragedy was already spreading through cell phones, in frantic texts and calls. The plane to Vancouver? It crashed. The phrase echoed through the corridors, in different languages, with the same note of horror. At least for now, we are safe. And so is Daniel. But Karina felt the knot in her stomach tighten even further. It wasn't just a delay. The silence that followed was almost palpable, a vacuum of sound and air, broken only by muffled screams and the desperate cry of a child. Daniel paled, his phone slipping from his hands and falling to the floor with a clatter. Sarah held Karina's hand, a firm, comforting squeeze, her eyes moist but with an unwavering inner strength. Airport police and FBI agents began to cordon off the Gate 17 area, erecting yellow tape and directing people away. "Miss, we understand that you are in shock and distraught by the event," an FBI agent said to Karina, his voice monotonous and tired, his eyes fixed on his clipboard. Karina tried to explain the vision again. The sensation, the smell, the darkness. 2 days passed. The world mourned the tragedy of Flight 378. News inundated TV screens, with experts discussing mechanical failures, unexpected storms. Karina was staying in a small hotel in Seattle, her mind unable to settle. "You are not alone, dear," Sarah told her in one of the calls, her voice calm and comforting. The plane trap had been avoided, but Karina knew that the thread of their lives was thin. Fear was a parasite, gnawing at Karina's peace, settling into every thought, every heartbeat. 3 days after the tragedy, life in Seattle felt like a slow-motion film, people moving in a stupor of grief and uncertainty, the news relentlessly hammering home the tragedy. Karina felt disconnected, a stranger in her own body, haunted by the premonition and the feeling that death was hot on her heels, breathing down her neck. Daniel thanked her distractedly, his thoughts still in Vancouver on the lost contract. As he reached for the cup, his hand brushed against a loose wire from a nearby lamp, a frayed wire that looked precariously repaired. A bluish spark. The smell of burning rubber and overheated metal filled his nostrils. "Karina, I had something." "That's it, Daniel. I knew it. Death hasn't given up. It's actively hunting us. You need to be careful, very careful." A crane, hoisting a massive metal beam, swayed precariously in the air, a visible mechanical failure. A cable snapped with a resounding crack, cutting through the momentary silence the height created. The beam plummeted, scraping the side of the building with a metal tearing sound, like a cry of pain, before crashing into the middle of the street, a few meters in front of Daniel, raising a thick cloud of dust and debris. "Where are you?" He had just narrowly escaped being crushed by tons of metal. It was a trap. The beam could have fallen directly on him if he had walked a few more steps. The fire, what he had seen in the cafe, the spark. It wasn't the fire itself that directly threatened him, but the cause of a trap that would result in fire or destruction, in collapse. The loose wire, the electrical spark, was a warning, a trigger for the next threat. Are you somewhere safe? The fear he felt now was different from the fear of the plane. It was a more personal, visceral fear, the feeling that death was right beside him, watching, laughing. Death wasn't just out there, lurking. It was actively seeking them, weaving intricate and personalized traps to catch them, exploiting their routine. A premonition. He knew he had to share what had happened, to warn her. They were linked by this experience, by this curse. And with each trap they avoided, the feeling that their time was running out became stronger. The city of Seattle, which once seemed a vibrant refuge, now felt like a minefield. Every corner, every sound, a potential trigger. The next trap could be anywhere, at any moment. It wasn't a clear vision like yours, but sparks, a fire. I smelled it. I felt the heat. I don't know where, but I felt the danger. It's death, Karina. It's active. For a millisecond, Daniel saw the image. Not a plane exploding, but a building on fire. Glass bursting, flames dancing like demons, consuming everything in a roaring blaze. He was trying to convince himself more than her. The hot, unbreathable air. The sharp sound of sirens, the despair of people trapped inside. Think about where you are. What's happening around you? The cafe was cozy. People relaxed in their conversations and on their laptops. What could go wrong here? He remembered the image of the burning building. It wasn't the cafe. The fire he saw was much larger, much more destructive. He stood up abruptly, adrenaline pumping through his veins, the need to escape undeniable. He needed air. He needed to think. He needed to get away from that place that, for an instant, felt like a trigger. Death is cunning. It uses what's familiar to catch us. It was a flash, too quick to process completely, but visceral enough to make him recoil sharply. The latte cup fell, spilling hot coffee all over the wooden floor, leaving a dark stain. He tried to focus on the sounds of the city, the hum of cars on the street, the distant cry of a seagull soaring above the buildings, the muffled music from a nearby store. But the image of the fire persisted, a constant reminder of imminent danger. He passed a building under construction, a towering glass and steel structure that seemed to scratch Seattle's gray sky, still incomplete but imposing. A sign out front announced the grand opening of a new convention center and offices in the coming months, with digital renderings of a modern, gleaming interior. Something clicked in his mind. The fire he saw, was it there? The height, the metal structure, the sense of grandeur and danger. The breeze from Puget Sound, which once invigorated her, now brought a chill, like a cold breath from beyond. Daniel, on the other hand, tried to return to his routine, a vain attempt to impose order on the chaos his mind had become. He was at a cafe in downtown Seattle, his laptop open, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, but his mind far away, reliving the plane scene. Karina's voice. The strong aroma of fresh coffee and the soft jazz music that floated in the air couldn't drown out the hum of anxiety in his head, nor the vivid memories of the explosion. "Sir, your latte." The barista, with a gentle smile, placed a steaming cup on the marble table. "Is everything all right, sir? Did you burn yourself?" The barista asked, startled, coming over with a cloth to clean up. Daniel took a deep breath, his heart pounding against his ribs. He looked at the loose wire, at the small smudge of soot on the wall, at the spark that still shimmered in his peripheral vision. It hadn't been a fire in the cafe. It was something more. Another premonition? He remembered Karina's words, the horror in her eyes, her desperate voice. Was death really pursuing them, now in new, more insidious forms? He called Karina immediately, his hands trembling so much he could barely hold the phone. His voice was tense, hoarse. Karina felt a chill that made her shiver. "I'm in a cafe." "It's safe," he replied, though his voice revealed the growing doubt that gnawed at him. "Don't trust anything that seems safe," Karina warned, her voice serious and urgent. Daniel looked around. As he walked through the streets of Seattle, the cold wind from the bay embraced him, the salty smell of the sea and fish filling his nostrils. Suddenly, a worker high on the structure yelled, a shrill sound that echoed off the concrete and steel. Daniel stopped, his heart in his throat, the air seemingly failing in his lungs. He looked at the twisted beam on the asphalt, at the screaming workers above, at the cars braking sharply and honking in panic. Daniel pulled out his phone, his hands trembling uncontrollably, and called Sarah. Sarah, oblivious to Daniel's near accident on the streets of Seattle, was in her Boston home, a charming Victorian townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, its windows adorned with climbing vines. The smell of freshly baked blueberry muffins permeated the kitchen, a sweet and familiar fragrance that always calmed her. Daniel's voice on the phone, however, dispelled any sense of peace, bringing back the heavy atmosphere of Seattle. She had always believed in hunches, in something beyond Cartesian logic, an intuition that guided life's events. "Daniel, calm down. Take a deep breath. Are you safe now? Physically unharmed?" "Sarah, I almost got hit by a beam from a building under construction. I had a vision before, a spark, a fire. But I don't feel safe. We can't hide forever, Daniel. Nor can we lock ourselves indoors. But we can be alert. Lovely day, isn't it, dear?" "Yes, it's lovely." She felt a shiver. The original premonition was about a plane, and began walking towards the parking lot, her heart pounding, a frantic drum in her chest. Her previous plans to visit Pike Place Market and the famous Seattle Aquarium now seemed like a terribly dangerous idea. "Water," Karina said, her voice almost a growl, filled with desperation and conviction. But a series of incidents, woven into the fabric of everyday life, exploiting routines and habits. Upon returning to the hotel in Seattle, exhausted and still shaken by the near accident on the street, he decided not to use the elevator, opting for the stairs, feeling a strange repulsion for the enclosed space. The game became more dangerous, the traps more ingenious and personalized. They had survived 6 direct threats, but the shadow of death hung over them more strongly than ever, a heavy burden they carried day and night. The only certainty was that fate, patient and relentless, was preparing its checkmate. They knew the end was near, but the mystery was how and when. A moment later, as he climbed the second flight of stairs, an announcement on the loudspeaker informed that the elevator was out of service due to a temporary electrical failure. The smell of burning rubber permeated the air, coming from the elevator shaft. Another spark. Another potential fire. The premonition of the spark wasn't about a specific building, but about electricity in general, about failures that would lead to chaos, to fire. The traps were subtle, disguised, exploiting their deepest weaknesses and fears. It puts us at greater risk. Death is playing with us, Sarah. It wants to separate us or bring us together, to catch us all at once. We need to be aware of where we are. Death adapts. If we join up, it will have a bigger target. She needed to stay away from water, in any form, from anywhere. She felt the explosion, the smell of smoke. But there was something more, something that had haunted her dreams ever since. A recurring feeling of panic and helplessness. A feeling of drowning. Water invading her lungs. Perfect for a walk and to feel the sea breeze. Where are you now? What's your next step? I feel like it's laughing, Sarah. Have you seen the tide pools? Full of life. Dangerous if you don't know where you're stepping, of course. The tide comes in fast, and the ground is treacherous. She pointed to the shoreline, where slippery rocks were exposed by the low tide, preparing the next trap. And the mention of water and tide pools echoed in Karina's mind like a deafening alarm bell. Tide pools. Sarah, death is coming for me through water. Pools, rivers, the ocean, even torrential rain. I feel it. I had a recurring dream, the sensation of not being able to breathe, of being submerged. It's my trap. Water. Drowning. That was it. A trap linked to water, but in a cunning way, disguised as natural beauty. The premonition wasn't just about the plane, but about the method of her own death, which had adapted. It's like a cruel game. It's death pursuing us, Sarah. It's active, more than ever. Daniel's voice was altered, his initial skepticism replaced by palpable terror, a terrifying understanding. I need to come there. I can't leave you alone. It's too dangerous. His breathing was ragged, and Sarah could feel the panic in every word. Sarah listened in silence, her mind working fast, connecting the dots. Yes, Sarah pondered, her gaze lost for a moment on the antique window frame, watching the gentle sway of leaves on a tree in the backyard. I'm heading back to the hotel in Seattle. I think it's the safest place I have right now until I decide what to do. I need a shower and to try to process all of this. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Karina was sitting on a damp wooden bench in Discovery Park, the cold wind from Puget Sound whipping her hair and carrying the salty smell of the sea. The vast gray sea stretched out before her, a reflection of her own uncertainty and the fear that enveloped her. She felt the energy of death intensify, like a hungry predator approaching, its fangs sharper. The traps, she realized, were not random. They were personalized, preying on her weaknesses, her habits, her deepest fears. Suddenly, an elderly lady with a colorful scarf on her head and a kind smile sat beside her on the bench, her blue eyes gleaming with curious gentleness. Karina forced a smile, her lips barely moving. The elderly lady continued, her voice soft, like a whisper. I love coming here. The water calms me. The words, dangerous if you don't know where you're stepping. She quickly said goodbye to the lady, almost tripping over her words of thanks upon reaching the hotel, breathless. She called Sarah. Sarah was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. The gravity in Karina's voice was undeniable. "Karina, I'm in Boston." "No, don't come." She was right. Death was adapting. It was no longer just a catastrophic event, a grand accident. That day, Daniel avoided a second trap. The three survivors felt the net tightening. With each escape, the tension increased. The sense of pursuit was palpable, a cold shroud enveloping Karina, Daniel, and Sarah, suffocating any remaining peace. They were trapped in a macabre game, each trying to decipher death's next moves, like pieces on a chessboard where time was the opponent. Every sound, every flickering light on an electronic panel, every unexpected movement of a vehicle on the street was a sign, a premonition of a new trap. The distance prevented her from acting directly, from being by Karina and Daniel's side, but she was in constant contact with them, offering advice, researching inexplicable accidents and strange patterns, seeking an answer, a way to break the cycle. A home, once a sanctuary of peace and cherished memories, now felt like an observatory of an impending tragedy. He saw a car smashing into a power pole, the streetlights exploding in sparks, smoke spreading into the air. It was the accident. He had narrowly averted it again. He had escaped once more, but the sense of relief was overshadowed by the grim certainty that death would not give up. For an instant, Daniel saw the image of the crane, the falling beam, and now the car accident. She rushed to the phone, dialing Daniel's number with trembling fingers, the frying pan on the stove forgotten. "Daniel, are you at the airport?" Sarah shouted, her voice almost hysterical, panic evident. He yelled at the driver, his voice sharp and urgent. "Turn around." Landed abruptly on the runway, skidding and coming to a stop just a few meters from the fence with one of its wings broken and the fuselage dented. The sirens of ambulances and fire trucks already echoed in the air, a deafening sound that confirmed the disaster. Go the other way. Death had used a smaller, safer flight to try to catch him. The pattern was clear. It adapted, changed the conditions and type of transport, but the underlying method, the threat related to air travel and movement, remained. The plane trap had repeated itself, but in an unexpected, more subtle way. Now, the game became more dangerous, the traps more ingenious and personalized. They had survived 6 direct threats, but the shadow of death hung over them more strongly than ever, a heavy burden they carried day and night. The only certainty was that fate, patient and relentless, was preparing its checkmate. They knew the end was near, but the mystery was how and when. "Get out of here." The confused driver hesitated for a second, looking in the rearview mirror. Daniel pulled a large amount of money from his wallet and handed it to the driver, whose eyes widened. "Turn around now or I'll pay you double. Just turn. It's a trap. It's the flight. Death is waiting for you there. Listen to the news. Turn on the radio." The radio was playing a local news program with soft music in the background. Suddenly, the programming was abruptly interrupted by a breaking news bulletin. A small private plane, which had taken off from a local airport, had suffered a critical engine failure and was returning for an emergency landing. The report described the airport. It was the same airport Daniel was heading to. The pattern was clear. Death was using movement against him. Vehicles, moving structures, anything that could become unbalanced, collide, or unexpectedly fall. The reporter's voice described the troubled plane, smoke coming from its engine. He looked out the taxi window. The vehicle was approaching the airport. A few kilometers away, he could see the runway and a small aircraft circling, emitting dark smoke. It was the flight he had planned to take, the safe, chartered flight. The smell of blueberries, so comforting, was now accompanied by the faint odor of chlorine from her backyard pool, a constant reminder of Karina's premonition about water, a cruel irony. "Are you hurt?" The taxi driver asked, his voice trembling, his face pale with fright. He refused to use any public transport, preferring taxis, and incessantly checked his driver's routes on his phone's GPS, as if he could predict an accident. His work, once his passion and source of stability, had become an unbearable burden. His virtual meetings filled with nervous pauses and constant vigilance of his surroundings. The aroma of coffee, which once calmed him, now brought a chill, reminding him of the spark and the smell of burning. Karina, obsessed with staying away from any body of water, spent her days in libraries, museums, or simply walking through crowded streets in Seattle, where the dangers seemed more diffuse, diluted in the crowd. The smell of old, dusty books and the constant vibration of the city were a temporary palliative for the fear gnawing at her. But with every raindrop that fell, a chill ran through her. Daniel, on the other hand, had become paranoid. Sarah, in Boston, felt a deep anguish. The next trap hit Daniel treacherously. He was in a taxi, heading to a smaller airport on the outskirts of Seattle, hoping for a chartered flight he believed to be safer, an alternative to large jets. Traffic was heavy, the asphalt streets wet and slippery from the fine drizzle that had just fallen, and the late Seattle afternoon air was thick with car exhaust. The smell of gasoline mingled with the acrid smell of an old tire and wet rubber. Suddenly, a deafening noise. An out-of-control delivery truck swerved into the oncoming lane, its horn blaring like an infernal alarm. The taxi driver slammed on the brakes, the car skidding dangerously on the slippery road, the sound of tires screeching cutting through the air. By millimeters, the truck brushed past them, scraping the side of the taxi with a horrible metallic sound. Daniel felt the impact, not physical, but a wave of shock reverberating through his soul, an echo of the tragedy that almost struck him. The vision came in quick, terrifying flashes. The sound of metal twisting, the smell of burning rubber and leaking oil, the violent impact. "Are you okay, sir?" Daniel merely nodded, his body shaking uncontrollably, cold sweat trickling down his forehead. In Boston, Sarah was preparing dinner, the aroma of garlic and herbs wafting through the kitchen, an ironic contrast to the tension she felt. Sarah felt a lump in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. On the other end of the line, Daniel heard Sarah's urgent voice, and then the taxi's radio, which the driver had turned on. "Don't get on that plane, Daniel." Daniel saw death once more, this time personified in a small smoking plane, an easy target in the sky. The taxi made a sharp U-turn in the middle of the road, leaving the airport behind. Just as the small plane, with a dull, terrifying thud, Daniel took a deep breath, his face pale and sweaty. Karina, Daniel, and Sarah felt exhausted, their energy drained by the constant tension. With each escape, the pressure mounted.